All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the AliDoIsWin podcast. And today I have such a special friend, the amazing Sam Miller. And Sam Miller is a coach that you guys should be following if you don't already. Shame on you. He is one of the most intelligent people under, are you under 30?
I mean, I'm technically out of that bracket now.
Under 40,
Do I look
we should
like
say.
I'm under 30?
Yeah, because I'm under 40 still.
If I shave, I look like I'm like 17. So
yeah, no, keep the beard. Keep the beard. Sam and I met through our mutual friend Jay Tita, who has both taught us very much about the world of hormones and women's health and men's health and everything. So Sam and I have become pretty good friends this year, and we are basically each other's kind of go-to when it comes to certain things hormone related. It's really nice to have that type of friendship with people who do similar things. And Sam also coaches other coaches in the world of functional nutrition and medicine and all these things. So I'll let him give you guys a little bit about his background. But Sam, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thanks for having me. I'm definitely a little jealous of your podcast name, like your title. Is when I saw what you came out with and then I saw the album art, I was like, man, I kind of wish that was my first name so that I could make that my podcast.
If only I could be sponsored by, DJ Khaled.
DJ Khaled, yeah. Well, you do need maybe like an intro song. That should be like the segue into.
Yeah.
I don't know how you'd have to work that out with like maybe licensing and.
Yeah, that might cost a pretty penny. We're not there yet.
He's like, we don't care about your podcast about hormones. Sorry.
Yeah, like, sorry, dude. That's like not our wheelhouse.
You just gotta like send him some test or something, and then maybe he'll be down.
Yeah,
you're like, hey,
he needs
dude, this
it.
is good for you. This is good.
He needs it.
Yeah. We'll lose some weight.
I know. So how give the audience a little bit of background about how you got into this, because I love your story. I know you've told it to me before, but I love how you got into the world of hormones and everything.
Yeah, so I was similar to a lot of teenage guys, wanted to be more athletic, wanted to look better. I was reading Men's Health. I finally, eventually stumbled across T Nation and things like that, common sources that a lot of coaches and even regular folks in the fitness industry have, come across today. And I really ended up down that rabbit hole. But around that same time, I actually had a pretty significant injury snowboarding. And unlike just like, regular injuries, like maybe you sprained your wrist or anything like that, I actually had a pretty severe concussion. And so won't go into too much detail on that particular day, but basically a combination of that and just I would almost label it as like what amounts to basically chronic dieting experience, that being super active as an athlete, maybe not necessarily eating appropriately for someone who's in their late teens and early 20s, because I was reading something like Men's Health, which is for the 40, 45-year-old who has a beer belly and needs to lose 15 pounds. And there's not really a lot of education about nutritional periodization, or in other words, like how do you set up your nutrition in phases or seasons where you have fat loss phases and you have muscle building phases. And so I never really grasped that until I sought out the education myself. So with the little information I had, it was kind of like the corners that I would turn to on the internet or the magazines that I would buy. It was either good information that was misapplied or not necessarily taught in a way that worked for me, or it was completely incorrect information that was also either misapplied or it was applied, and that made things worse because it wasn't accurate information to begin with. So my journey really started with a combination of just, wanting to get in shape, wanting to be a little bit healthier, wanting to look better. As my friend Brian Borstein would say, attracting honeys. And from there, we kind of like progressed into, oh shit, like I have an actual, some issues here. And I didn't understand the connection between, so like my brain actually has something to do with, my metabolism and my hormones and the ability to build muscle. I just thought of it as, well, it's like food, and you go to the gym and you get jacked and you drink protein shakes, and then you maybe go to the supplement store and get a few extras here and there, and you're like good to go. But unfortunately, that's not really how it works. So that sent me down a rabbit hole, spent probably more time getting lab work and visiting with different endocrinologists and getting MRIs and things that you don't normally do as someone in your late teens. And even into my early 20s, it kind of continued. So for me, it was really a multifaceted experience of, I was on the receiving end of a lot of information, and I really had to figure out, well, how do I filter this and distill this into something that I can use in my own fitness transformation? But around the same time, because I had that interest to begin with, I had already started some coursework and taken some personal training classes in high school to prep for getting my first certification. And then throughout college, that was always my part-time job. I was either a trainer or a fitness supervisor or working in a nutrition store as well. And I was getting a lot of folks who weren't responding with like the conventional, diet model or conventional exercise model and doing more cardio, and a lot of the misinformation that was still out there, especially we didn't have, this makes me sound super old, but there's no Instagram. Facebook was a newer thing, and your information was coming from either forums or media sites, online magazines, in-person magazines. So information traveled a little bit slower. And so the gurus who had the information, it was kind of like, do as they say. And I think we live in a time now where that's a little bit different, where you could have someone like Ali who has this podcast, or I have a podcast, or Jade has a podcast, and you can go and seek out different opinions and information, and you'll see that there's patterns and trends with the good information. So like Ali and I have a lot in common. Jade and I have a lot in common. You'll start to notice like, okay, so I'm going to put two and two together, and I realize like, this is how I should go about my transformation, or, working on my hormones or my metabolism or whatever the case may be. So my journey was like a lot of frustration. It was definitely a little bit longer than most people. So for me, starting in my teens and going through now, I'm 31 and still figuring some of this stuff out. But I think one of the reasons I'm, passionate about it, they talk about, I forget what podcast it was Dr. Sean from Active Life. And he's like, so that was like your Peter Parker get bit by a spider moment. And I'm like, well, I don't know. I mean, I was kind of already a fitness nerd and kind of health nut at the time, but it definitely accelerated it to some extent. So that's kind of how I got into it. And then now I've kind of branched into, as Ali said, working with coaches, and then also spent over a decade working with folks in their own health and fitness, and working on metabolic adaptation, hormonal dysfunction and dysregulation, and starting to look at the functional side, which is really just because of my own interest in learning the endocrine system or hormone system, and then figuring out like, okay, how do I improve my quality of life? And then using that information to help other people too.
And you grew up in Connecticut, right?
Yeah, so I was born in New York, and for the most part, school for me was like in Connecticut, at least for most of my primary and like through high school. So.
And then you know Ben Bruno.
I do know Ben Bruno. So Ben and I ended up on the same forum, intensemuscle.com, which is interesting because Ben is from kind of the Northeast, but towards New Hampshire, Maine area. And so I met Ben through a couple different internet forums, and him writing online and becoming a little bit more famous, I guess you could say. So Ben's super interesting dude, but we connected while I was in college, and I think he was going back to school, and he was at Columbia at the time. This was before he worked for Mike Boyle. So he wasn't famous training Justin Timberlake and Jessica Biel and Kate Upton yet, but we kind of hit it off and had a lot in common, because we were the only really like much younger dudes like posting workout logs or following along and learning from old guys. And a lot of really cool people came from that group. I have a friend who now owns a really great direct-to-consumer supplement company. Ben came from that. Obviously, he's more of a celebrity trainer and works with athletes as well now. There's also Dr. Scott Stevenson was on that board, a number of different things. So really an interesting mix of people, to be honest, but that's kind of how that connection happened back in the day.
It's funny because like most of my audience will know who Ben is, but you and I have commented where we know each other through Jade, but like you have a following that is nowhere in my world and vice versa, yet we have all these like mutual connections. And it's just so funny how vast and large the whole world of like training and nutrition and coaching and everything is.
Yeah, so, for sure.
And we have
Ben seems to be a common thread with a lot of people too.
Yeah.
Especially in the Northeast.
Yeah. And what I love about him too is that he has not changed as a person whatsoever. Like I had him run a workout for my bachelorette when we were out in LA, and he texts me and Charlie like, hey guys, how you do? Like normal. He hasn't forgotten where he came from. He doesn't let it go to his head. And he's like, I don't know why people get like that. Like just be a normal person. Like he's so humble. Yeah. I love him.
Yeah, he's really cool.
The also we have in common how like we've been through learning about lab work and what doctors do and stuff ourselves, just from our own personal interest as to issues that we've had. And we've talked before where coaches have asked us, well, like, how do I learn everything? And aside from obviously taking your certification and mentorship, there really was no other education that you and I had. So it was going through all different doctors' processes, spending thousands of dollars on labs, learning through podcasts, having conversations, because there really is no like path of education for a fitness professional slash coach to understand this stuff other than what you've organized, which I think is awesome. And we can talk about that at the end, but I do want to get into some of the more prominent topics that you've covered that you were very good at. And one thing that you and Jay do very well is simplify very complex topics, especially when it comes to female hormonal health and birth control and stuff. And
For sure.
So I've listened to a few of your podcasts you've done surrounding these topics, and I know that you have a little bit more of a female clientele than I do, but I will get questions about birth control and stuff that I don't feel as qualified to answer as you do. Whereas I think a lot of women don't even know what their cycle should look like. Do you find that happens where they have no clue what a regular female hormonal menstrual cycle should be?
Yeah. So in terms of women having an understanding of a regular cycle, I would say it really depends on generational differences, as well as, at what age did you go on the pill and start birth control? That makes a huge difference. How long have you been off of birth control? So there's a lot of different variables that play into the level of understanding with women's health. And I was going to say, when you're doing you're kind of outlining our differences and similarities, I was like, well, you could just take birth control, this like third B, and add it to your boners and biceps that you've already got going on. And it's like boners, biceps, and birth control. But yeah, it's really interesting in terms of the women's health dynamic. I would say my following's pretty mixed. I do have a lot of men who are experiencing either testosterone or thyroid related downregulation. I also do have a lot of women who are either struggling with high estrogen, low progesterone, or even something like the umbrella terminology of PCOS, which we can talk a little bit about that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Or women who are kind of post-birth control, or maybe women who are, maybe postpartum or anything like that. So in terms of women's health, though, I think what's important for women to understand is basically every month with a cycle, you will have sort of this ebb and flow of hormones. So you have a follicular phase, which comes first. So I always try to use that. You think follicular first and then luteal last. And then you kind of remember, okay, well, after my follicular phase, that's leading up to ovulation. And after ovulation, moving into that luteal phase, we have this really crucial hormone called progesterone. Progesterone is protective. So if you can kind of like link that follicular first, luteal last, and progesterone being protective, you can start to understand, well, why would my body make progesterone? Progesterone is basically that segue where if you were to conceive after ovulating, it would be very protective for the baby. If you don't have adequate progesterone, that's one of the top reasons why you might miscarry. And so for women, it's of crucial importance. So when you can start to understand, well, maybe there's a reason that this hormone comes out to play, and maybe there's a reason that my body behaves this way. And so with progesterone, we do see some changes in metabolism and insulin sensitivity and stuff. We don't have to go too far down that rabbit hole, but really what's important to understand is that cascade would better support survival and development of a baby and also a mom if you're about to go into 3 full trimesters of growing a human and then trying to breastfeed afterwards. So when you're not necessarily thinking of it from how humans evolved and adapted, basically the adaptive physiology component of it, it kind of leaves, I think, a lot to this kind of hard science that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. But if you can zoom out and apply some common sense to it and practical life situations, it begins to, make a little bit more sense. And so opposite of the luteal phase, we have our follicular phase. So with follicular phase being first, really what you're looking at is you want estrogen to be a little bit more prevalent during that component. We'll also get a little bit of a LH and FSH surge. Those are just triggers or basically precursor hormones. So they're like the hormones before your hormones. So Ali talks a lot about in men's health, we need LH and FSH prior to testosterone, and LH basically signals if you have healthy testicular function, you're going to get production of testosterone. Well, in women, that LH and FSH is equally as important. It's just timed across our 28-day cycle. I say hour, but I'm not really cycling. I'm just kind of here with you.
I do that when I talk about the men's stuff too. I'm saying we.
Yeah, I'm just here with you supporting your accumulation of knowledge about your health. So
Yeah.
I do find a lot of women that are less familiar with that and why it's important to have a regular cycle. Obviously, if you're continuing to menstruate, that can help to balance things like iron levels as well. So there's a lot that goes into it, in addition to the hormones, but having that balance does help from both a metabolic perspective, and also you'll notice sometimes performance improves a little bit in the follicular phase as well. So that's kind of cool. So it can give you a lot of clues as to maybe what you should be doing in your own life. And so you mentioned a popular topic right now, which is birth control, and women not necessarily having a lot of awareness of that. What we have to understand is, just like when we intervene with TRT or exogenous testosterone, birth control is an exogenous hormone. Now, the difference between this and something like hormone replacement therapy is, with birth control, we're getting the exogenous hormone, but it's a synthetic version, not necessarily what our body would naturally produce. So it's important to understand, if you're taking in an exogenous hormone, what we just talked about kind of goes out the window, the follicular phase and luteal phase. Now we kind of put that on the back burner for a later date. And in the meantime, what's going to dictate the way we feel and our metabolism and our lab work is going to be based largely on the hormones that you're taking in through your contraceptive, whether that's a pill or, a NuvaRing or Depo-Provera shot or anything like that.
So the statistic for women, I think it's around 60% of women get put on it for reasons other than preventing pregnancy, right?
I think the statistic's pretty high, and it can be anything from uncomfortable cycles, or basically PMS or PMDD. It could be irregular cycles. It could be due to acne or skin related concerns. It could be just because their parent, women's parents, or they think that they should be doing it because their friends are doing it. And while there is some education in some countries, I think especially in the United States, it's a little bit more of a controversial topic right now around like how people should be educated. And as a coach, I think it's important we understand, it's really about, well, let's just talk about what a healthy cycle looks like and what birth control does physiologically. And then from there, women can make the choice of, here's what's going to be best for my situation based on my health and my fitness goals and my family planning and everything else that I'm doing. And here's what my options are. And at least you understand there's like a little bit of context to it, whereas I think a lot of times there's not as much context to it. So I think that's what's tricky. But yeah, there's definitely other reasons you'll see younger women going on the pill, or even I've seen clients or mentees who are working with folks who might be in their 40s or 50s, and they're just coming off birth control, and they went on birth control ages ago to where they might not even remember exactly why. It's just been so long in terms of having that influence on your endocrine system. So
that I find a lot of that. Some of the women that I do train in their 40s, they're still on it because they don't like having a period, or their only reference of what a period is when they were 17, 18 and had the worst cramping possible, very heavy flow, all that stuff. So what causes these issues where girls are experiencing heavy flow, a lot of cramping, that would make them have an uncomfortable period where the doctors are like, here, we have a pill for that?
right. So you have to remember, I encourage women to think back, well, what were you eating when you were 15, or what were you eating when you were 17? Was it that you have the worst period ever, or were you not providing your body with ample nutrients? You weren't necessarily supplementing. Maybe you were deficient in certain things. Maybe there was an imbalance of certain hormones. And so when it's not just about, I want high hormones or I want low hormones, we kind of need ratios. And it's a little bit of, I talk about cortisol sometimes, like people demonize it for belly fat, but it's like, you need a cortisol awakening response in the morning. Well, for women, it's like you need estrogen, but also progesterone has its own, its own role and its own purpose as well. So we can't really like demonize either one. And I think the problem is, when women aren't educated about, here's what a normal cycle looks like in terms of follicular and luteal phase, or the two phases to a cycle. And you could argue that you could split those up into smaller sections, but for simplicity, if you don't understand what the ebb and flow looks like, it's a little bit harder to understand, well, what's going wrong. So first, by understanding where you should be, you can understand how I work closer to that. And that's why I like for women to track things like morning body temperature and they can see a little bit of the changes. And by looking at biofeedback, that can be super helpful too. And then with those things, and once you become aware of your nutrition, you have a lot more control over how you actually feel during those times. I mean, there are women where their cramping and symptoms improve just with small substitutions in the diet, or maybe for a week or so, maybe they don't have dairy or something. And that's a little bit more anecdotal from clients and mentees and things like that. But there's also women where, hey, like I needed more magnesium or I need more B vitamins. And when we don't necessarily have the requisite amount of those nutrients, of course our body doesn't feel, its best. It's just like the guys who listen to your show and it's like they want better boners, but it's like they're not doing the things they need to do to support, testosterone levels. And so for women's health, it doesn't have to be the bane of your existence. It's just, it's a signal. It's your body is basically signaling, hey, there's a problem here, or hey, we don't want to blunt that biofeedback. And basically when we rely on birth control, we're kind of shutting down the side effects we were previously experiencing instead of asking, well, why am I having these side effects?
Mm-hmm. That's always getting to the root of the problem before making it a Band-Aid. And so I know like women listening to this who have been on birth control for a while are wondering like, oh, wow, maybe, that's the reason why I can't lose body fat now, or maybe that's why my stomach is messed up. Like, can you describe like some of the detriments that happen for being on it for a long time?
So I think before going into the detriments, maybe just teaching a little bit about like, well, what are you doing when you're taking birth control, right? You're usually getting, basics. So you're either going to typically have progestin, which is not the same as progesterone. It's actually synthetic and it behaves a little bit more like an androgen, whereas progesterone is more anti-androgenic. And then you can have exogenous estradiol, but it's not bioidentical estradiol. It's actually ethinyl estradiol, which is a synthetic estrogen. So it's a little bit different. Most birth controls are either a combination of ethinyl estradiol and progestin. So think of that as synthetic estrogen and synthetic progesterone. Well, that behaves a little bit more like an androgen. So it's not really progesterone. It's either a combination of those, or what's really popular now is there's certain generations basically of progestin. And so progestin being that synthetic androgen, some birth controls are progestin only, or levonorgestrel is like a super common one now, and you'll see it in different mechanisms that's basically delivered. And so depending on the birth control that you're getting, you may be getting either a blend, what's called like a combination pill, and that's usually an oral contraceptive, or progestins, which are available in shots or NuvaRing or pills. From what I remember, that's kind of a brief recollection. You can always double check what you're on or what maybe you've been on in the past by just going to the website of the manufacturer and seeing what the active ingredient is. And then if you just kind of search the active ingredient, you'll figure out like, okay, this is maybe more estrogen, ethinyl estradiol, synthetic estrogen, or whether it's progestin. So when you're consuming those, you do suppress your body's production of your hormones. And so a key difference here, and you mentioned this a little bit before we hopped on, is, well, is birth control kind of just replacing those hormones? And the answer is no, it's not bioidentical hormone replacement. It's actually a synthetic hormone that behaves a little bit differently. And you might say, well, how does it behave differently? Well, hormones can go down different pathways. It's kind of like there's forks in the road and they can choose where they go. And depending on what you're taking, that's going to influence that and different metabolites, but also they act on different receptors. So if progesterone naturally is anti-androgenic, that's going to have a very different effect than, say, progestin itself. Progesterone also helps sensitize estrogen receptors. So basically just think of it as it helps prep us for when we're in our luteal phase, we go back to the follicular phase. Progesterone is not only doing what progesterone does, but it helps to make estrogen do its good stuff too. It's not just like a one-sided thing. There's kind of this balance, yin and yang there, or kind of like sisters in a way. So when you take birth control, you are suppressing those hormones that would be produced otherwise. So that example I gave you earlier of follicular first, luteal last, now it's like, well, I'm not really sure what phase I'm in. And some of those changes that we normally see, like body temperature, ebbing and flowing, that might go away. We might start to see more of like a monophasic type environment where we don't have this ebb and flow. We might start to see changes in thyroid function. There's really a whole host of things that can happen, lowered testosterone levels, SHBG, which is basically just a binding protein that will bind to your reproductive hormones and influence what they're able to do. So that's kind of a breakdown of like, well, if I started taking birth control, here's how it's going to influence my cycle. And then here's kind of what birth control does to begin with. And the goal there is to prevent, conceiving a child. So if you're not ovulating, you are not able to procreate and basically be fertile. And then so you're not going to be able to do that. So when you're taking birth control, you're basically blunting ovulation by suppressing your hormones and the negative feedback loop that's in there. So basically our brain is perceiving, hey, we're already getting this exogenous synthetic estrogen, or we're already getting this synthetic progestin. We need to adjust our production of the hormones that we were making previously. And so there's a little bit of downregulation that occurs as a result of that. So the brain is kind of doing its thing. And then maybe we're not, because of that, not ovulating. And then those hormones have their own effects as well downstream, like separate from what the brain is signaling and messaging and all that good stuff.
It sounds really bad. It sounds like it's like just suppressing and everything. And the period, I have air quotes, that women get while on it, with the ones that actually allow for a bleed, is just a pharmaceutically induced bleed, right? It's not.
Yeah, so it's basically a pill bleed is different than, so you have to think of a healthy cycle as characterized by ovulation and menstruation, as opposed to just, I had a pill bleed. So that would be a big difference there. And so what Ali's referring to is maybe you were taking an oral birth control and you go through a row of placebo pills or sugar pills that you're supposed to take, and you do have some form of cycling, and then you go back to your hormonal pills for 3 weeks or so, or whatever the circular design is, or the square leaflet packet that you have, and you basically take that. And some women will skip that altogether and not necessarily have a cycle at all or a period at all. But I would really argue that we can look at what's healthy by looking at, okay, are you ovulating and are you having progesterone? Now, some folks in the medical community do argue, well, there's no medical need for having a period, or there's not like this medical need to necessarily ovulate. So they try to address a lot of problems through birth control and basically prescribing that as a way to regulate irregular symptoms or irregular cycles. But it kind of puts a Band-Aid on things and doesn't necessarily improve it. I would say some women have had better experiences on certain birth controls than others. And some women don't have the degree of side effects that others do. And some women bounce back really quickly, whereas other women maybe notice the change in testosterone levels or libido or thyroid as a result of what's going on in that hormone that they're taking. So it's kind of hard, unless you've tried multiple birth controls, or you just got lucky and picked the right one, or your body happens to be pretty adaptive and resilient. I've seen women come off the same birth control, and some it takes months, and then others, maybe it takes a full year to get your cycle back. So it's kind of, I think, dependent on the individual, but also, what's your nutrition behind the scenes? Are you depleted in certain key nutrients and vitamins and things like that? We know birth control does influence that to some extent, but I think where people really notice it in terms of their biofeedback or symptoms is we do, depending on the generation of birth control and the pill that they're taking, or if maybe it's not a pill, so something like Depo-Provera, for example, that one can have a really kind of lasting side effects because of the half-life. So basically it just means how long the drug is in your system, and your body's kind of processing it. So those can certainly cause some issues as well. But it does sound, when you say it like that, you're like, man, is there really that much good that comes from it? And you have to assume, for some folks in certain situations, and from a woman's health perspective, like, I think we should have options where women can pick, but I think that education has to come first. So I can't be over here telling people what to do with their body. Like, that's not my job. My job is just to educate and say, hey, here's what happens in a normal cycle. Certain birth controls do this. There's also other options of birth control, and they do different things. And, a shot is different than a pill, which is different than an IUD, but they all have different effects and different hormones contained in them. And some of them have the same. And just being educated in your own health and being an advocate for your own health and asking the right questions and getting lab work, I think, can go a really long way. So I see a lot of people who are like demonizing it, like, well, you should never ever take it. But there might be women in certain situations where, it's been really, really important for them. And, I can't really judge that. It's just important to understand you might need to do a little bit of work to get back to your baseline and your normal physiological state after taking the birth control.
It's a great overview. And I know it's also a difficult subject being a man sometimes to talk to women about this. Because even with me, they're like, well, I should have better options, or there should be options for men. And we know all too well how well the fight to try to push something birth control related for men has gone, where it's really something that would give them no libido at all. So it's like they're not going to want to have sex anyway.
Which happens a lot with women's birth control too. I mean, the SHBG changes and testosterone changes, I mean, that alone, plus not really having follicular phase and ovulation, I mean, sex drive does change a lot, or at least reportedly, when you look at some of the research and just anecdotally with a lot of clients, definitely influences it as well. It is tough as a dude, because I think you have to acknowledge, well, birth control did allow certain women where it's like, if they were very career focused or career oriented and they didn't want to have children, or maybe if you're in a situation that's unsafe and you need to prevent, basically conceiving a child or something, then there's certainly situations where it can apply. And it's not really our place as coaches to jump in and intervene there. It's just, hey, we want everyone to be educated on this and figure out, this is what's going on from a hormonal perspective. This is what's going on with your labs. Let's help you understand it. And whether you've never taken a pill in your life or whether you've been on it for 10 years, let's help you figure out what you want and what's best for you in your situation. And it's just the same thing with, when we talk about TRT or we talk about bioidentical hormones, which are a totally different story. And I think there are less side effects and risks and things like that. It is different in the sense that it's analogous to what your body already produces. Right. But I think there's just a lot of, I think people are either on one extreme or the other. It's like, well, team pharma and we need to have this birth control, or no, it's terrible. But a lot of folks who are on that side too are monetizing that position. So I try to look at, rather than following the money, let's look at what does actually happen to people, and then let the people decide like what's going to be best for their health. So
yeah, I mean, I don't remember when my first gynecologist appointment was. I think it was like 16 or 17, because my mom put me on birth control because that was the thing to do. And I hated it. Like, first of all, my boobs grew and I was like, this is kind of cool. But other than that, like, I got fat and I didn't like it. And then it was like, it was the pill, and then it was the NuvaRing, which it was annoying. And I remember I've now since fired about 4 of my gynecologists just for their, ineptitude about understanding real hormone stuff. And I love mine now, who's a man. But I remember before, like, it's almost like you have no choice when you're in the office, because they say, all right, well, what are you doing for contraception? What do you mean? Well, what pill are you on? I'm not on one. Okay, so which one do you want to go on? It's like you're forced into it almost. Like, do you want paper or plastic? Like, these are your choices. Or, are you doing pull out and pray? Or they don't call it that, but like, it's almost like they
it's like they don't
guilt
understand
you.
Yeah, with like,
guilt you.
In between fertility awareness method and, you've got loads of options at your disposal. I feel like that was a terrible phrase that I could use in this situation, but you do have a lot of options at your disposal.
She said.
Yeah. So I feel like whether it is, education, and I know in health classes and stuff, people talk about condoms and how your health teacher puts, a condom on the banana or whatever, but there's not as much education. Even if you were to go to your OB's office and say, maybe you wanted a copper non-hormonal IUD, what's very interesting to me is what they have in stock in the closet is either, hey, you can walk out with some birth control pills, or something like Mirena, they already have there. They literally say, okay, let's just switch it for you, or we can do an appointment right away. Whereas if you wanted something that was a non-hormonal option, and you have to look at balance of copper levels in the body and stuff too. So you still need to pay attention to your health with non-hormonal options, but it's just an example of where with pharma, the way it is, that option wouldn't even be in your doctor's office. You probably have to call ahead, order it, wait 10 days and then go back and set up a separate appointment, and your insurance may or may not cover. So it's a very, very interesting situation in terms of the accessibility and practicality of different options, but no one really, unless you're in this space, I don't think a lot of people talk about, well, there's a non-hormonal IUD, or, here's how you would use fertility awareness method, or here's the level of percentage effectiveness of your pull and pray option that you sort of outlined. So, that's something that I think has to fall into the conversation too. Now, whether that's done by the same health professionals as the people who educate you about your hormones, that may be a different conversation, but I still think that women should be able to like do a little bit of research, understand what's going on, but also just knowing what questions to ask. It's not necessarily that you have to have all the right answers, but it can be really empowering to know, hey, well, this is what my goals are with my health and fitness, or with my family planning, or with my career. And then you basically, as a human being, can decide what's best for you depending on what those goals are. So I think that's a cool conversation to get clients to that place where they're informed enough to seek out second opinions and be an advocate for their own health. Because that's really, whether you're talking about women's health and birth control, or you're talking about testosterone replacement or anti-aging, or really anyone, the goal is, how do we inform someone to where they're autonomous and they're educated about their own health, to be an advocate and stand up for themselves? Because as a coach, we can't always be there for them. So I think that's why education is so important. And whether we're having this conversation about testosterone cypionate, or you said NuvaRing or Depo-Provera, like, it's still important to have the conversation, but help people choose, what's most aligned with their aspirations.
Yeah, people have to be an advocate for their own health, because it's so misunderstood, especially even with women's hormone replacement. The difference between, as you mentioned, the bioidentical and the synthetic, but then they'll put you on birth control, but then tell you that the bioidentical will cause cancer, when it's really the synthetic stuff that is troublesome. And
you would love the conversation I had yesterday, which was with a doctor who was an OB for 15 years, but now he's in HRT. And he says, well, we have super physiological estrogen levels during pregnancy. Do you think that pregnancy is a carcinogen? And when you think about it like that, you're like, well, should we be worried about, higher levels of estrogen and progesterone when our body does that naturally when we're developing? I say we again, when women are developing humans during pregnancy. I'm just along for the ride, guys. So I get very invested in it. So that's why I say we're on the same team. So, he used a great example of, with hormone levels being, at that state. And he's like, well, you're not even going to do that with hormone replacement, because you're just looking to optimize where you are in general. And so bioidentical progesterone, there's several different options for that. Estradiol, there's a number of different options for that. Testosterone, there's a number of different options. And the key point to articulate in the difference from birth control is we actually, those hormones will act on the same receptors. They kind of play nicely. It's like, if our body was a playground, they're kind of still going to behave the same way, versus unleashing like these kids that are from another school that have never met and they don't get along with the kids who are currently on the playground, and then creates the kind of wreaks havoc on the system, versus when you kind of know what to expect, there's like an ecosystem that's already there. There's already balance that's there. So I think it really is important, because a lot of people lump them into the same thing, or they hear progestin and they're like, well, oh, so basically if I'm taking progesterone, I'm like, no, that's not the same.
And it's funny how you catch yourself when you say we, because I always do that when I'm like giving a talk or talking to guys, but I didn't even notice that was weird, So I wonder if like the guys think it's weird, because I'm like, yes, when we develop our testicles, like, and then I'm like, oh, well, I don't have testicles, but I'm just like part of you guys because I'm a bro. Yeah. Like, we get it, it's funny. So I'm glad I'm not the only one that catches themselves. But you did mention the IUDs, which I always get asked about. And people are like, all right, well, if you had to develop like a hierarchy of best birth control to the worst, talk about that, but also the IUDs, because the copper not being hormonal, the pros and cons with that too.
Okay. So I have to, throw a disclaimer out there. So obviously I don't know everyone listening, so can't necessarily like pick what's best for you, but I'll walk through like some of the pros and cons. I would say it's easiest to establish like worse options. I've seen the most difficult time in regaining normal cycle health and ovulation with Depo-Provera, because it's such a long acting hormone, and because there's a shot associated with it, and it tends to suppress endogenous progesterone for quite some time. Mm-hmm. So I would say that is the option that I would not gravitate towards. Now, even on the other side of non-hormonal, and you look at a copper IUD, you still have to take into account it is typically larger than your hormonal IUDs. It's working as like that barrier method. It does cause some inflammation locally. It's localized inflammation as well as being a barrier method. And you do have to look at ratios in the body. I mean, you're putting copper in your body, so you need ratios of like copper and zinc and other minerals. And our body tries to maintain homeostasis with those things, just like it does with hormones. So I would say if that's something you're more comfortable with, then great, go have that conversation with your doctor. If, that's not something that you're comfortable with, then you probably don't pursue it. And then in the middle, there are IUDs that contain small amounts of hormones, usually different doses of levonorgestrel. I have seen several women on like the higher dose IUDs, like Mirena has a good bit of that progestin in it, where the first couple years they feel okay, but on the tail end, there's like lower testosterone levels, potentially lower progesterone. The effects of it seem to be more pronounced, even though it's supposed to be this localized thing. I try to think, well, does the body have a mechanism for sensing hormonal balance and regulation throughout the entire body? Like, don't we always have hormones both systemically and acutely all the time in different, basically, like if you look at thyroid hormone or vitamin D, we have basically all this stuff, like cascades of reactions going on all the time throughout the body. So to think that, well, I'm going to put this here and it's localized in my brain somehow, my hypothalamus and pituitary that regulate hormonal function are not going to be perceptive to that, seems like we think that we're tricking the body. Like, it just seems questionable. Is it possible? Maybe, but it's also, there's a lot of the IUD research in that case, I think was like a 1990 study from like I want to say it was like some Norwegian country. I think it might've been Sweden or something like that. But so there's information on it, but less. You also have to remember the issue with research and evidence in the realm of birth control is what they're studying is this an effective contraceptive? And then the safety data is, well, you didn't have adverse effects in the sense of like death or cancer or very severe things, but little things like weight gain or not achieving your fitness goals, that's not viewed as like a super detrimental side effect the same way that for us, we would say in the fitness industry, that's a super detrimental side effect, but it's not necessarily covered, in research because they're looking at safety and efficacy. Like, is this effective to prevent pregnancy? And we forget that sometimes. It's like, oh, wow, I guess that's why all the research is on that and less about, I want to look really good in a bikini over the summer and I have fitness goals.
They should go hand in hand though. Like, because obviously like, all right, if you're going to be preventing pregnancy, then you'd be having a lot of sex. But if, you don't look the way you want in a bikini, maybe you're not confident enough to put yourself out there. Like, I never thought of the psychology about it, but it's crazy. So
yeah, it's interesting. I mean, when you think about how all of that connects, and I guess just to circle back to your hierarchy question, because I don't want to leave everybody hanging on that, I would just say there's going to be a gradient spectrum of options and more or less hormones and things to consider. But I would not consider a hormonal IUD to be a non-hormonal option or separate from the bucket of oral contraceptives. I would just look at it as it's acting via two mechanisms. And if you're not going to remember to take a pill or something like that, talk about that with your doctor. But from the standpoint of like probably most suppressive to the endocrine system to maybe less suppressive to the endocrine system, that scale that I sort of outlined, you basically have, your progestin, the shot on one side, and then you'd have options like NuvaRing and hormonal IUDs with higher amounts of hormones in the middle, and then progressing towards, your oral birth controls or low dose, lower dose IUDs and then copper IUDs on the other side. But while there are different hormones and stuff, if you were to get labs on yourself or anyone else, I think it's just important to acknowledge that like a lot of them will have parallels in terms of the effects on feedback and, your pursuit of your goals. So they're different, but without knowing you as an individual, it's really, really hard to figure out. Like, I don't know your current hormonal profile, but that's why if we take the two most extreme options, we can kind of say, well, this is literally void of hormones, whereas this is suppressive and very long acting and contains hormones, and probably not the best idea for, unless it sounds super appealing to you to have that going on in your body.
I'm surprised NuvaRing is still a thing. Like that would like come out and freak out the dude, and like no one liked it. It was not a good time.
I've never encountered NuvaRing. I've coached women and mentored coaches working with women with the depot shot, and that's like every 3 months and very long acting and suppressive, basically a birth control shot. That one seems to be very problematic. Have had women who love their copper IUDs, and then other people where maybe they weren't super keen on the idea. So I don't know. This is where, as a dude, I try to be like, here's some information on it, but I can't be the one to be there with you when you're in your OB's office or anything like that.
I mean, you could.
I could,
like,
but
you would like my OB because we just talk about men's health the whole time.
Oh, okay, cool.
Because he's a guy.
That's my kind of appointment.
Yeah. So like when women say, okay, fine. So, you know, they decide they want to go off their birth control, or they no longer want to use that as a method, or, you know, regardless whether they try to get pregnant or not. If they want to do some form of natural birth control, like I know Clear Blue makes ovulation sticks now that you can pee on and stuff like that. Yeah. Like what are some methods that they can consider?
So similar to tracking temperature for overall health, you can track body temperature for fertility awareness and looking at when you're ovulating. There's also several different apps that you can basically download and mark your symptoms, and also it will try to algorithmically figure out what your cycle looks like. So that has some percentage accuracy in addition to kind of, you know, your other methods of choice or what you're actually doing. Or, you know, you could basically, it'll outline for you like, hey, use protection here, or maybe less protection needed here, or proceed with caution, or hey, you're super fertile or you're not super fertile. That can be helpful from the app perspective. But I really like body temperature. Also, just, you know, if you don't have a super great memory, tracking those things of, hey, here's when I had my cycle last month, and here's about when I should be ovulating. Those things alone make a huge difference, because you're most likely to need contraception or have an issue when you're actually ovulating, right? Versus there are going to be times of the month where it would be very, 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 very challenging, if not statistically improbable or impossible, for you to have an issue with contraception or conceiving. And there's not a ton of education on that. So I'd say body temperature is a great place to start. There's a lot of different apps. You kind of have to figure out the one that fits you best, that's most like user friendly for you. And it's also take into account, are you having regular cycles? Because a lot of women don't have the most regular cycle, and it's important to get that regular first, because it'll be easier to determine what's going on, you know, in terms of what you need to be doing with your health or sexual partner, etc. Once you understand, hey, I have a pretty clearly defined follicular phase, luteal phase. I know when I'm ovulating, I can sense the difference in biofeedback and body temperature. And now you can even use things like Aura or Whoop to identify changes in HRV during cycle health. So that's an option too. I think Aura is working on developing some more technology around that, or pairing, maybe syncing with another app. I thought I remember reading that somewhere, but those are all really great options. The same things that keep you informed as a, you know, client or as someone who's monitoring your fitness. It's like, it really all kind of goes hand in hand.
So how long, like, how long should somebody track before they're like, all right, I have a handle on this? Like a full cycle, even if they're not regular, like track for a month and see if there's any pattern?
So I try to have clients just do it, you know, once they get used to taking their body temperature, just like leave it on your nightstand or in your bathroom and kind of do it first thing. The more data you have, the better. It's kind of like if you were tracking macros and you went to a new coach and you're like, here's my food log and exactly what I ate, versus someone who hasn't tracked macros before. Mm-hmm. So body temperature is just a tool. It's just a data point. Sometimes going beyond that, you know, 30 day, maybe 60 or 90, because sometimes we'll get slight changes, and as life stress changes, or if you have any nutrition changes, or if you're dieting, we want to, you'll have other benefits to tracking body temperature. For example, if your body temperature is always low, you might also want to check your thyroid. So
Right.
yes, we're monitoring cycle health, but also even if you're seeing net changes in temperature, but your temperature is always low, we might want to go and say, hey, let's pull some, thyroid labs, look at your free T3 and see how that's doing and things like that.
Yeah, I guess like I'm saying, like if someone comes off the pill or the shot or whatever,
Oh, okay. So
and
you're
they
saying
wait,
irregular, they've been off. Okay.
right?
Yeah. So for that type of person, I'm usually, usually you're going to get labs shortly after they come off, and you pretty much are going to have to, I start tracking body temperature until it's normalized. Or if they're planning on using fertility awareness method, they're just going to, instead of putting a pill in your mouth every day, you're now putting a thermometer in your mouth every morning to monitor your body temperature. Like it just kind of changes, like we're just changing the habit from one habit to another habit, which can be really helpful because depending on what you were on, it's not necessarily going to bounce back in like 2 weeks.
Right.
I mean, depending on the person, some people do, some people don't. And no, if I was working with a client or advising someone who's working with a client, I would be tracking it almost throughout the length of the relationship, just until we accomplish whatever they're trying to accomplish. Or unless they're super healthy and regular and then they're family planning and they're like, well, we're trying to have a baby, so it doesn't matter, like we're just gonna try until we have one.
Right.
Then I think that would be the only time where maybe you would taper back on that, or they were just a little bit less anal about contraception or something like that. But
And does it matter time of day?
I like just wake up and take your body temperature. Personally, it's
Keeps
the best.
simple.
Yeah, it's the most consistent, and you start to get variables like, if you've been drinking something, or even if you brush your teeth and stuff. It's usually easiest if you either, as soon as you wake up, like if you have an alarm or something and you just leave it next to that, take your body temperature, or before you brush your teeth, or maybe you go to the bathroom in the morning, just walk into the bathroom, grab the thermometer, take it, and then go about your day, because otherwise there's just too many variables and you will see changes. I mean, even if you have a Oura ring, you'll see changes in heart rate and body temperature throughout the day. So, if you're exercising or anything like that, it starts to create a lot of variables to where we don't really have that same pulse or rhythm that we're looking for.
And lastly, I know there's probably another episode we can do on PCOS, but I know the PCOS women will be like, well, what about me? My doctor said I have to be on birth control for my condition.
Right.
So your thoughts on that? You don't have to go too deep into it, but kind of like an overview. And obviously if they want to explore that further, they can work with you, but kind of what is the background on that?
Yeah. So PCOS is really an umbrella term designed by Western medicine to incorporate women who fall into certain criteria. Basically, the Rotterdam criteria was identifying, hey, do you have irregular cycles, potentially insulin dysregulation, and excessive androgens? Those were kind of primary criteria. And then depending on having two of the three, you would get lumped into PCOS criteria. And so then doctors and OBs and women's health and primary care physicians started to lump women into situations like, well, you're skinny PCOS because you're not overweight and you don't have insulin dysregulation, or basically creating these different sort of hybrids. And we also have the criteria from the National Institutes of Health. But it's important to understand that PCOS, or polycystic ovarian syndrome, is really just a term. But if we were being super precise as health professionals and practitioners, we would identify the symptom of what the person is experiencing, or the biological or physiological characteristics. So for example, I have, inflammatory, elevated inflammatory markers, insulin dysregulation, and excess androgens. Okay, that's what you have, rather than saying PCOS. Or I have more adrenal driven PCOS, like that's more of a thing as well. But conventional PCOS, typically you're seeing insulin dysregulation, irregular cycles, sometimes excess androgens, which can be, that's where a Dutch test can potentially be helpful in addition to serum labs. And usually if you're looking at the serum labs, you'll see a 3-to-1 ratio of LH to FSH. So by doing that, it's helpful because for someone who's irregular cycles with high estrogen, low progesterone, and maybe low androgens as well, maybe they're post-birth control, that person would benefit really well from certain supplementation and lifestyle changes that would elevate the LH to bring back, ovulation and then progesterone and getting that amount in the luteal phase that we need. But if you were to do that with a woman who's already has high LH, you would exacerbate her condition. And that's where, as a coach or functional health practitioner, or even as a doctor, it's important to understand the different clinical characteristics as well as biofeedback and symptoms. So I would argue that PCOS is really an umbrella, and underneath that umbrella, we have several different prongs. And there's more studies coming out. There was a 2018 Bahrainian study on several hundred women, and they looked at CRP to albumin ratio as a predictor of PCOS versus just things like waist circumference and obesity and insulin and glucose, like insulin sensitivity, and things that are previously more stereotypical indicators of PCOS. And I believe in certain populations, like Middle Eastern populations and stuff, I think the incidence of PCOS might be slightly higher. So that was a helpful, and I say maybe because I'd have to double check that if that's still a thing or if I'm misremembering. But I remember in that particular study, they were looking at something like CRP, which is really cool because we use that same marker in cardiac health for men and looking at inflammation, and as a really good longevity marker too, and just for diet and nutrition. So if you're a female who's been told that by your doctor, I would first ask, why do I think that I'm receiving this label or falling in this category? Because categorically, is it because of the irregular cycles? Was it cysts on the ovaries? Which is also I should have included that for Rotterdam, but is it cysts on the ovaries? Is it the irregular cycles? Is it the androgens? Is it insulin dysregulation? Kind of figuring out, okay, which trait or characteristic do I need to work on, and how am I addressing that with my lifestyle, nutrition, supplementation, et cetera, or functional medicine if needed, or Western medicine, et cetera. So we're going to look at those and then ask a more specific question. Once you address that specific question, then you can start to think of, the solutions for the problem that you're having. But a lot of times women may have irregular cycles or something's just slightly off, and they fall into that category. But truly, is it like the conventional, and if you're not watching this on like YouTube or Instagram, air quotes, PCOS. So it's really important to look at that and understand the difference between PCOS and HELP, which is high estrogen, low progesterone, or, do you actually have lower estrogen, or do you just have super high cortisol, or do you just have high androgens, or is everything out of whack or kind of high? So depending on where you're coming from and where you've been, were you on birth control, off birth control, what was kind of a precursor there, those can all make a really big difference.
Because women who had no signs of PCOS before even going on birth control can induce it by being on birth control, right? I've heard that, where it's PCOS.
Yeah, so you can have basically like post-birth control syndrome, and that's sometimes where PCOS will come into play. So I think for ease in the insurance-based Western medical system, the classification exists, and post-birth control, rather than addressing individual hormonal factors, women are sometimes given the label of PCOS because of what they're experiencing. Now, if you're in a highly stressed state, potentially overtrained, having some, both the adrenal production of androgens as well as high levels of cortisol, suppressing progesterone, which progesterone being anti-androgenic, you could end up teetering over towards that type of hormonal profile. But I think a lot of times in women, it's probably 50-50, or maybe, it might be a different percentage, but if I had to guess, there's a subset of women who post-birth control do fall into the clinical characteristics of what Rotterdam or NIH would consider PCOS. And there's probably half that they're just not having regular cycles because they were on an exogenous hormone that suppressed their cycles, and they have one or two of the traits, and they're being labeled as that because then under insurance or Western medicine, it's here's metformin and birth control, because even if you don't have insulin dysregulation, I've coached clients or had women, or even a girl I dated in the past, it was like, well, you're going to go on metformin because you have skinny PCOS. It's like, but you have no signs of insulin dysregulation. Like why, so they're looking at metformin for things like inducing ovulation or LA, like they're looking at other facets of that. But we also have to remember, if someone is highly stressed, whether toxicity, inflammation. There's different things that impose stress on the body, but specifically, if you just look at cortisol itself can mobilize energy. It's really an alertness response. So if it's not necessarily an external factor, but it's our lifestyle, and we have a lifestyle driven hormonal problem, if I'm constantly stressed, if I'm over exercising, if I'm not managing my nutrition, if I'm not sleeping, cortisol will mobilize energy substrates in general. And so our body, if we're also eating, like, we still have to do something with that energy. And so insulin's job is basically to figure out, and basically shuttle it to different places, and whether we're storing it in muscle, storing it in fat. And so sometimes you'll get that elevation in insulin because if you're chronically having this elevated blood glucose, whether from food choice, lifestyle, stress, sometimes we'll just see folks with elevated blood glucose from like a dawn response. But when you're seeing that, you have to remember, well, my stress and my sleep play into it. It's not just only people with a sedentary lifestyle sometimes see elevated blood sugar levels. So when you understand that and you see the drivers of insulin, when you get elevated insulin, that can influence LH signaling as well as what's going on with female hormones as well. So that's kind of the connection to PCOS and how you can drive. There's like stress induced insulin resistance as well as like stress induced, hormonal imbalance or dysregulation. And it can err on the side or hedge towards PCOS. But the more I study it, the more I start to dislike the term, because I find I'm like, well, really, why don't we just call it what this person is experiencing in their labs and like what this person is experiencing, based on their lifestyle and their quality of life and biofeedback. And so when we get so systematized and lose that individual aspect, well, it's like, how did that person get to the current state that they're at in terms of the clinical characteristics that Western medicine is using to put this label on them? Because we're going to need to reverse engineer it anyways to figure out how to help them. So if we don't do that, really, we're just, we're neglecting a huge part of what got them there in the first place.
Yeah, thank you for that explanation, because I think a lot of women are kind of confused when they get labeled with that, and then they look it up and it doesn't make sense as to what they're experiencing. So, and you did a great podcast on like common medications that people are usually on. Metformin was one of them. So you guys need to check out Sam's podcast. It is a wealth of information on all these topics, and I'm definitely going to have you come back so we can nerd out about the men's health side of things, because that's
I love
always
men's
fun.
health stuff.
And then when you say we, it'll actually make sense. And when I say we, it won't, but I'll just run with it.
I'll be like, guys, I have balls too. It's cool. The common client medications episode, actually, now that I think about it, so many of the women in this situation, like SSRIs, oftentimes are used postpartum, or when women have hormonal dysregulation, or when men have low testosterone. Metformin, kind of, similar. And metformin's a little bit different because it's like studied in a way that it has a lot of safety research and different data behind it. Doesn't mean we necessarily have to use it, but I think it is different than something like an SSRI or birth control or anything like that. But it's still super common, and women who get the PCOS label oftentimes end up with that cocktail of medication when they leave the office.
So for any coaches who'd like to work with you, what types of programs are you offering right now?
So I have a couple different things. Easiest way to start out is I have a free group for coaches on Facebook. It's the Nutrition Coaching Collaborative. I post a ton of, Allie's, I keep her in there. She's the muscle. So if you start acting a fool, she's going to kick you out. I'm just kidding. Allie just pretty much chills in this.
I hop in.
She hops in there from time to time. I'll just tag you and I'm like, this is relevant for Allie. So have that Facebook group, Facebook community, post a ton on Instagram. Allie mentioned the podcast, which is just my Instagram handle, which is Sam Miller Science. I try to keep it consistent across all platforms. My website, sammillerscience.com. My main sort of flagship program right now, and where my focus and energy is a 12-week live specialization program for coaches. So if you're interested in things, in learning more about metabolism, physiology, hormones, adrenals, women's health, men's health, gut health, common client medications, learning a little bit of the functional blood chemistry, also research and evidence, we basically cover that live together. So instead of being stuck watching like modules by yourself or reading and doing self-study quizzes all the time, you actually get to be with your peers and ask questions about case studies or clients or real problems. And we meet on Zoom And you also get a portal with private information and trainings and stuff in there too. So that's kind of my bread and butter right now, and where my main focus is. I'll have, by the time this airs, you guys would basically be looking at the 2021 program. So you can get more information on that through either my Instagram or the Facebook group that I mentioned. Also, website is samlerscience.com/FNMS, all capitals. So we can like link that up for you guys too. But that's it's kind of my thing. It's what I do, other than hang out with Ali and annoy her and send her memes and gifts and stuff.
It's fun. I didn't respond to your ones this morning, but I promise I will. But you guys, like, for all you guys that asked me, you know, what resources, what should I study, what should I read, take Sam's course. It is so worth it. Even though I applied and I got denied, I know all the material that's in there. I got rejected. No, I'm kidding.
I just think it'd be hard. Like, we'd be in the men's health section and Ali would have like a whiteboard behind her. She'd be drawing something inappropriate, and
how you can never learn enough. And honestly, you're like I said, you're a very, very huge source of a lot of very amazing information that you simplify. For as young as you are and as smart as you are, it's quite impressive. And I'm glad that you're a friend. And enough with the sap. So for
I'm
people,
getting so emotional. You also said I'm huge, so I'm
you are, dude. You are, Jack. You are.
Thank you.
It's okay. And if people want to work with you personally, like as a client, do you take on clients one-on-one?
I'm supposed to be slowing that down, but I will always here's my commitment to you guys. If you're in a difficult situation, if you need support, you need help, obviously Ali can help a lot. And obviously you trust her and listen to her if you're on her platform. If you reach out to me, I will try to either, whether it's through my team, and I do have an assistant coach who helps with a lot of cases. I will either try to help you personally, introduce you to someone who can help you, point you in the direction of maybe a doctor who can help you. So we're not going to leave you hanging. I can't necessarily promise that I can work with you one-on-one at this point, because time is, with the mentees that I have and coaches and Facebook group and things, providing a lot of free education out there. It is difficult to take on all of the complex one-to-one cases that I love to work on. But what I would say is, depending on your individual situation and where you need support, I would just say reach out. We can figure it out and have a conversation, and then maybe it's an intro or maybe it's on my team, but we'll figure it out. I've had to get better about acknowledging the 24 hours in a day that we all kind of play by and live by.
We could use some more of those. So definitely check out his Instagram page, guys, Sam Miller Science. He's got a ton of free info. You literally should charge for access to your page. That's how abundant
it's going to be
is.
Private. I'm going to have an OnlyFans for my my hormone content now.
For all the dorks that are like, we want the deep stuff. Yeah. Like, what are you doing looking at OnlyFans? Well, it's like, you know, HPA access and stuff.
Yeah. Or I just put it on private. I guess I could do like a request to follow and have like a little membership fee. No, I mean, it's important that this information's out there, whether you are at a place in your career where you can choose to invest in continuing education or not. I want everyone to have at least a pulse on the problems that we're facing as an industry and why it's important. And then at the right time in your coaching journey, in your career, you can reach out. And also for the folks who are listening to this who need help, it's like one of the reasons that I have my program that I have for coaches is I want there to be hundreds of options for you guys where people know their shit and you can go to them and, you know, you can be, you know, on their roster and they can be able to help you out and move you in the right direction. So it's kind of the ripple effect of when coaches get coaching and can help more people. It's something that I get super excited about, whether it's the free content or otherwise. And then, you know, we'll see. I may have to put the OnlyFans on the back burner, but I'll leave my Instagram public for now until the podcast airs so people can follow.
That's what I love about you and Jade, though, is that, like, you know, we're all like, we just need this message spread. It's not a competition. We're all in this together. The more people that know this information, the more people that we can help. So it's a collective movement, so to speak. So Sam, thank you again for coming on. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ali.